أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم رب اشرح لي صدري ويسر لي أمري واحلل عقدة من لساني يفقهوا قولي أما بعد. Dear ulama, teachers, brothers and sisters in Iman, Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. It is an honor and a privilege to be amongst all of you. It has been a journey coming here, but alhamdulillah, we are all here. And for those who are joining online, if I knew there was an online option, no, I'm joking. It's great to be amongst all of you. So inshallah, I will be speaking about our Hadith tradition, and it sort of dovetails very well, I think, with the Shaykh's previous talk, in particular because I will be talking about our Hadith tradition in terms of how scholars have authenticated and have brought that tradition to our day. In other words, nowadays we have a lot of questions, and sometimes, after 1,200 years, these questions become very natural, that when the Imam says something 1,200 years ago, how do we know that the Imam actually said it? What did the Imam mean? And how is it relevant to our lives today? So that's more or less what I will be talking about. If you want to put it in context in terms of the previous talk, we'll be talking about, well, there is this almost 200-year gap between the books. 200 years is kind of a rough estimate, but 150, 200 years between the books that we have that are present and the books that were the sources for those books that we have today. So for example, we have the very famous book Usul al-Kafi and Furu' al-Kafi in the year about the death date of the author around the year 329, if I remember correctly. And then you have that author getting his sources from a previous generation, and we don't have access to those sources. And those sources come from a previous generation, of course, and multiple generations have passed since the time of Imam Jaffari as-Sadiq alayhi salam, and Sallu ala Muhammad wa ala Muhammad. So you all help me by sending these salawat. Allahumma salli ala Muhammad. Yes. Okay, thank you. All right. Until the time that we actually have the books. So for example, a book like Usul al-Kafi or Kamil al-Ziyarat, these are books that emerge in the 4th century, and they're talking about words and du'as and ziyarat that were mentioned about 2 centuries earlier, during the time of Imam Ja'far as-Sadiq, Imam Musa al-Kadhim, and so on and so forth. Right? So there's 200 years gap. And the question becomes, how do we fill the gap? Okay. I don't think you have mind the gap here, right? That's only in the UK. But how do you fill that gap or mind the gap between when we actually have the ahadith written down and when the books that we have available now? These jokes might be very corny, but please indulge me. All right, so now the question again, I will reiterate the problem, but I want to first start by mentioning a hadith. This is a hadith is actually a conversation between Yunus ibn Abdul Rahman. He is one of the very prominent, very sort of authoritative companions of the 6th, 7th Imams, and the 8th Imam. And he says that some of his companions, some of his friends come to him and they ask him, what is it that causes you to reject so many ahadith? This is actually one of the hadith that is relied on to sometimes kind of question the authority or the authenticity of our ahadith. Because look, the hadith narrator himself is saying, why are why am I so skeptical of a hadith? And this is a person who was living at the time of the Imams themselves. And so how can I, living 1,000 years later or 1,200 years later, rely on those hadith when the person who was living at the time of the Imam could not rely on those hadith? So the question hopefully is clear. But Yunus, he is asked this question and then he responds. He says that my teacher, Hisham ibn al-Hakam, the very famous companion of Imam Sadiq and Imam Musa al-Kadhim alayhim as-salam, he says that he heard himself from Imam Jaffar al-Sadiq say, only accept a hadith attributed to us that correspond, or only accept hadith attributed to us that corresponds to the Qur'an and the Sunnah, or one for which you have a similar hadith from before. In other words, look at all of the hadith that you all have heard from the Ahlul Bayt. If this hadith corresponds to those other ahadith, if it fits the puzzle, and if it's not sort of an outlier, if it's not saying something different, then you can consider accepting it as a hadith of the Imam. But if it is sort of an outlier, if it doesn't fit the Qur'an, the Sunnah, and the other ahadith, then we have a problem. Because Al-Mughira ibn Sa'id, very prominent forger of the ahadith of the Ahlul Bayt, the Imam says, may Allah curse him, tampered with the ahadith in the books of my father's companions, ahadith that my father did not say. So fear God and don't accept anything attributed to us that goes against the word of God, Allah Ta'ala, and our Prophet's Sunnah. Okay? So this hadith, again, is a very prominent one, and it basically points to our problem. The problem which was present even during the time of some of the Imams themselves. The problem I will sort of divide up into different parts. And that is, first of all, we are asking, and we want to know, did the Imam say it? Was there a hadith that the Imam actually uttered, a teaching that the Imam gave to his companions, and so on? The second question is, how do we know the Imam said it? So it's one thing for the Imam to have actually said the hadith. It's another thing for that hadith to reach me and for me to be confident that this is what the Imam said. Correct? It's kind of like the telephone game, right? So I know that the person said something and it sounds like, you know, the cat is in the house, but it might have been the cat is in the bag, right? Because telephone, right, changes and so on. That was another corny joke, but that's okay. So, right, on the one hand, I know that through this process, certain things change. The telephone process, right, certain things change, and it might change the entire meaning of the hadith. So I'm not very confident that what I'm hearing or what I am reading actually goes back to what the Imam said. It might correspond. So the Imam might have said, you know, for example, these are, and we'll talk about this later, that this is how you should do your wudu. This is the dua that you should recite while you do your wudu. But because I know there is this gap, this 200-year gap at least, I'm not confident that this is what the Imam has said. Now, the third thing is, if the Imam said it, why did he say it? Was he in a state of taqiyya? Was he in a state where he was saying something and he said something in addition to that line that is now recorded? So for example, the Imam might have said a larger teaching, but the narrator only records a small part of it, and I only get that small part. Did the Imam have any physical gestures about what he was doing? For example, he was doing his wudu, but the recorder only recorded the words of the Imam, and so on and so forth. And then the fourth question is, what is our responsibility? So all of these questions are questions that a hadith scholar, and particularly a faqih, who is trying to determine how to use these ahadith, these are the questions that he is going to be asking himself. The third, now we get to kind of the importance. And this is a little bit maybe very obvious to many of us, especially many of us who view sort of YouTube videos and are aware of kind of the conversation that is going on right now in sort of our communities, where there's this kind of uncertainty, there's this kind of doubt about where did our tradition come from, where did and how far we have gone from that tradition, right? So maybe the Imams said something, but because of those chains, then we are not sure about where we stand in terms of the teachings of the Imams. The few points that I want to mention, and these are amongst many others, are three. Why is this question important? Why is this problem something that we are all either thinking about consciously or unconsciously? That is because, first of all, it brings up a question about how confident we are in our scholarly tradition, right? Our scholars, we rely on them to pass on to us the ahadith and the teachings of the Ahlul Bayt, and to interpret those ahadith into our lives and for us to live and abide by the teachings of the Ahlul Bayt. That's the basic mission statement of the traditional Islamic scholarship. They take the ahadith, they verify them, or rather the teachings, not just the ahadith, but the teachings of the Ahlul Bayt, and then they interpret that for us into a lived practice and a lived set of beliefs and doctrines and so on and so forth. Now, if the confidence in the scholarly tradition, in this sort of 1,200 or 300 years of tradition, if that comes into question, then we might question our link to the Ahlul Bayt. And this brings us to the second issue, which is guidance. And that's ultimately what we look in the Ahlul Bayt for. There's a specific guidance. For example, how do I do this wajib act? How do I do my wudu? How do I do my salat? How do I pray and fast and so on? How do I transact with other people? And all of the other things that we are going to, inshallah, be exploring in these next few, in this day and today and tomorrow. Right? So individual points of guidance. And then there is general guidance. Just to kind of highlight this, and yes. I'm trying to go quickly because I think I'm short on time. I don't know how much time we have. Okay. So we have this ayah of Surah Al-Ma'idah. So this is an example of that question of specific guidance. How do I do my wudu? We all maybe have learned how to do our wudu from our grandparents and our parents. But we might ask ourselves, okay, now we have this ayah in the Qur'an that seems to be teaching us what wudu is, what proper wudu is supposed to look like. Surah Al-Ma'idah, ayah number 6, Allah says, أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم يا أيها الذين آمنوا إذا قمتم إلى الصلاة فاغسلوا وجوهكم وأيديكم إلى المرافق فاغسلوا وجوهكم وأيديكم. Do we have Arabic language learners in the room? You can raise, don't be shy, it's okay. All right, I'm not going to ask you any questions, but you can think about this on your own and ask the scholars present for why this is an issue. فَاغْسَلُوا وُجُوهَكُمْ وَأَيْدِيَكُمْ إِلَى الْمَرَافِقِ وَامْسَحُوا بِرُؤُوسِكُمْ وَأَرْجُلَكُمْ إِلَى الْكَعْبَيْنِ. Again, because this is a very specifically Arabic issue, Arabic language issue, I tried to display it in the translation to kind of give a sense for why there is some ambiguity here. O you who have faith, when you stand up for prayer, wash your faces and your hands up to the elbows and wipe a part of your head, period. And your feet up to the ankles, period. So in English, when I want to take that and your feet and take it back to the sentence, which sentence do I take it back to? Which commands do I take it back to? Do I take it back to wash your faces and your hands up to the elbows? Or do I take it back to and wipe a part of your head, your heads? Which one do I take it back to? Okay, we can take a vote here. See who has proper wudu, who does proper, yes. So, okay, so how about we have, who says, and wash your hands and your faces up to the elbows? Who says that's possible? Who says that's possible? Not that that's what it's saying, but that's possible. Okay, we have 2, all right, 3, 4, okay. And who says it's not possible and it definitely goes back to the previous sentence, and wipe a part of your heads? Okay, okay, so we have, and the rest of us, we have no idea, and we're just going based on what our parents and our grandparents say. And that's actually the conclusion of my talk, which is we go back to our parents and our grandparents and see what they said. Sallu ala Muhammad wa Muhammad. All right, the Arabic is vague. Some of the reciters of the Qur'an, they will say, they won't put that period. Arabic doesn't have periods and commas, at least the Qur'an doesn't, but they wouldn't put that period. They would say, بِرُؤُسِكُمْ وَأَرْجُلِكُمْ, right? There's a very clear connection between ru'us and arjul, but that's only some of them. The others will have what I have listed here, بِرُؤُسِكُمْ وَأَرْجُلَكُمْ, which seems to be a little bit more vague. And that is why this question has come up in the Muslim community, not just amongst the followers of the Ahlul Bayt, but even amongst the larger Muslim community. And so people have tried to figure out, well, which one is it? Which one is correct? Is it, do you wipe your feet or do you wash your feet? Right? Yes. Yes, you wipe your feet according to the school of the Ahlul Bayt. And what the Imams do is that they don't just say that, for example, this is something that goes against the Qur'an, but they actually try to argue through the Qur'an for their position. We can talk about that later, inshallah. All right, so that's a specific form of guidance that we need the Imams to tell us which is the correct method and which sentence does that verse go back to. All right, that might seem sort of menial, but of course wudu is a central part of our practice. A more general guidance, and this is a very beautiful hadith, or rather a conversation between Hisham ibn al-Hakam, that same person that I mentioned a little bit earlier, and a man by the name of Abu Hudayl al-Allaf, who is a very famous theologian, sort of debater in the time of Imam Jaffari as-Sadiq and Imam Musa al-Kadhim, I believe. So these two people, Hisham ibn al-Hakam, again, very famous companion, and Abu Hudayl al-Allaf, these were sort of the earliest debaters and theologians of the sort of in Islamic history that we know of. All right, there's a whole debate about when did Islamic kalam or theology start, but these are some of the earliest figures. What's interesting is that Hisham is this conversation, all right? And this gets to the core of our dependence and our relationship to the Imams. Abu Hudayl, he's part of a school called the Mu'tazila. He says, or he said, what later comes to be known as the Mu'tazila. It's just a school of thought, and they were not Shi'i. They did not take their beliefs from the Ahlul Bayt. All right? Abu Hudayl says, I will debate you to Hisham ibn Hakam. If you win, then I will follow your path. And if I win, you will follow my path. You will follow my madhab. Hisham responds, he says, you're not doing me justice. That's not my position. If I win, then you follow my path. right? And this is very sort of, not a sneaky way, but like a very interesting way of responding. And if you win, then I will refer back to my Imam, right? The conversation, the debates that they used to have was based on reason, on sort of this kind of sort of proving your point and trying to create a cohesive and a coherent doctrine. So for example, if I say that God, na'udhu billah, somebody says that God has 2 legs, then I have to say that God has 2 feet as well. And if I say God has 2 feet, then God has a body. And that is a problem because of this ayah of the Qur'an, right? So we're trying to create a coherent doctrine about Tawheed. If I say that God does not have a body, then we might have to ask, well, where is God? And so on and so forth. How can I point to God? All right? What Hisham is basically saying is, my reliance on my aql, my reliance on my intellect, is limited, just as your reliance on your aql is also limited. So there are vast amount of things. There's a large part of my religion and my belief and my practice that I will have to refer back to an imam for me to justify and authenticate my belief. Okay? Now, this gets to one of the main questions that I think we sometimes don't think about when we are thinking about how we deal with a hadith. And that is, when I look at a hadith, what is the goal, what's the purpose for my study of that hadith? Am I trying to talk about history? Am I trying to talk about something legal, trying to figure out wudu, for example, how to do wudu, or how to do salat, or how to do a transaction, and so on and so forth? Or am I thinking about something theological, where it's not enough for me to point to a hadith and say that this is what the Imam said about Tawheed. If I find a hadith that says, for example, that Allah descends onto the earth, and for example, He, speaks to people directly through His mouth, and the hadith gives me basically a physical description of Allah. Because that goes against my intellect, then I'll have to second guess what that hadith is actually telling me, right? The conclusion that I draw from that hadith. That is a hadith that I'm looking at through theology and through kalam. And so when we're looking at hadith, we also have to think about, well, what is my purpose and what's my goal for looking at this hadith? One of the things that this hadith of Yunus ibn Abdul Rahman, it talks about is the history of this problem of authenticating hadith. In other words, even during the time of the al-Bayt, the time of Imam Muhammad al-Baqir, Imam Jaffari al-Sadiq, this question was a very lively debate amongst the Muslims. I want to just focus on this hadith, and I'll come back to it at the end as well. The question is, when we are thinking and looking at our books of hadith after 1,000 years, sometimes we might think that all of these hadith that our scholars, our ancient scholars had compiled, maybe they were kind of sloppy about compiling them. Maybe they weren't paying as much attention as what we might do when we are looking at hadith. So for example, in our day and age, we might check our sources. Whereas people during that time, they might not have been as meticulous as we were. But one of the things that we get from this hadith, and we can maybe talk about it more if people have questions in the question and answer section, is the following. When we look in the hadith, in this conversation between Yunus ibn Abdul Rahman and his companions, we see that this is already an issue that Yunus himself is grappling with. That we have all of these ahadith and all of these books, and I have to figure out, well, which one of these ahadith is a hadith that has been fabricated by Al-Mughira ibn Sa'id or by other people and has been inserted into the books of, or into the sort of the literature of the Shia, right? And so this is a very old problem, is my question, is my point. Let me just get to a couple, 4 premises for what I'm going to, the solutions that the ulama have come up with, and then I will try to conclude by mentioning those solutions to this problem. The premises, these premises are basically, we have 3 main solutions that I have, I want to talk about today in trying to resolve this problem of hadith authentication and the verifying the ahadith, both in terms of whether the Imam said it, but as well, what do we do with it today. These premises, they kind of go, they are common amongst the different solutions. First of all, there's an sort of an understanding, and this kind of is borne out in when we look at the history of the time when hadith came to, were spread and the Imams were mentioning the ahadith. And that is that ahadith were mentioned and they were spread in historical light. In other words, during the time of Imam Muhammad al-Baqir, Imam Jaffar al-Sadiq, this is a time when the Muslims were already trying to figure out what was that process that I can use to authenticate a hadith. Again, this is around the early part of the 2nd century of Islam. And you already have a budding scholarly community. And this scholarly community is not exclusive to the Shia. You have a rising community of scholars amongst the larger ummah. And all of these people are figuring out, well, this is the way that I can prove that the Prophet, for example, said this. How do I prove that the Prophet said this? Well, I come up with a chain of narrations. Yes? So such and such person said, is reporting from such and such person, who is reporting from such and such person, who reports from the Prophet of Allah. Sallallahu alayhi wa alayhi. Sallu ala Muhammad wa alayhi. Now, the problem there is that you have a 100-year gap, yes, between when the time of Imam Muhammad al-Baqir and Imam Jaffar al-Sadiq and the time of the Prophet of Allah. And we don't have much writing between this time, at least publicly, right? There is a sort of what's commonly known as a ban in public writing, or writing that is distributed publicly. And so, at least for the larger Muslim ummah, who is relying on the Prophet and the ahadith of the Prophet and the companions of the Prophet, this problem is a very crucial and difficult problem to figure out. You have 100 years in which the ahadith of the Prophet of Islam or the Prophet of Allah are not written down. And you don't have ways of figuring out, well, where do these ahadith come from? That issue is not present for at least the ahadith of Imam Ja'far al-Sadiq and Imam Muhammad al-Baqir. Because during the time of Imam Muhammad al-Baqir and Imam Ja'far al-Sadiq, we already have this scholarly community developing with their own techniques for determining how ahadith are spread, how ahadith are verified and authenticated, and so on and so forth. And whenever you have a scholarly community, then you have an internal dynamic, okay? In the medical field, in other sciences, you have this kind of internal dynamic for determining what are the kind of the best practices that each scholar has to follow for them to be, for them to claim that they are sort of, they have a good standing within that community. If a medical doctor, he is selling, for example, snake oil, right, which does not have, you know, this kind of double-blind studies and so on, that person is not considered to be a doctor in good standing or whose recommendations are held in the same degree, to the same degree as a doctor who always sort of relies on, and I know there's a lot of problems about this in the medical field, but just bear with me. A doctor who, for example, only relies on sort of the latest and the most cutting edge sort of studies and so on and so forth, right? Those two doctors are not considered at the same sort of level of authenticity. That is something that we rely on a larger community, larger than just specific individuals, because that community has come to an understanding about what the best practices are for the community. So there's an internal dynamic that develops within each one of these different communities. The medical community might have one dynamic, the scientific community will have another dynamic, and so on and so forth. The third, and this kind of dovetails with the second issue, and that is ensuring authenticity and sort of ensuring the highest grade recommendations for this particular community. So the community will lay out their processes. And then the fourth issue is the function of a hadith and what role the hadith plays, or what's my purpose for looking at that hadith. Because I don't have too much time, I'm just going to very quickly mention these, the actual solutions. We've talked about problems a lot, and now we're going to talk about the solutions. The first solution is a very common solution that maybe we are very familiar with, and that is looking at the sanad, or the chain of narrators in the hadith, as the best way, or as maybe even the only way that we could verify the hadith. So for example, we look at this hadith. This is a hadith that is narrated from our sixth Imam, Imam Jaffar al-Sadiq, in which he references our first Imam, Amir al-Mu'mineen, Imam Ali alayhi salam. Sallu ala Muhammad. And this is a hadith, this chain of narrators is at the top. For those who are able to read it, no? Yes. For those who are able to read it, it says, وَأَخْبَرَنِ الشَّيْخ عَنْ أَبِي الْقَاسِمْ جَعْفَرَ ibn Muhammad. This is from Tahdhib, Kitab al-Tahdhib of Shaykh at-Tusi. So Shaykh is talking about Shaykh Mufid, and he is referencing his teacher, the person that he is narrating from Muhammad ibn Ya'qub. I'm sorry, yes. أخبرني الشيخ عن أبي القاسم جعفر ibn Muhammad عن Muhammad ibn Ya'qub. So the author of Al-Kafi, Al-Kulaini. And then he references عن Ali ibn Ibrahim عن Abi. And so the process would be, you look at each individual in this chain, and you say, for example, this person is a very authentic and very authoritative person. He never lied. He never made up hadith. He heard the hadith directly from his teacher, and he only reported a hadith that he heard directly. Okay? So you kind of vet each individual person in that chain, and you say, well, this person checks out. Next person checks out. Next person checks out, until you get to the Imam. That's one way of looking at verifying the hadith. The isnad, the sanad, the chain of narrators. The reason why this becomes such a prominent method is because, first of all, we don't have access to all of the information that the ulama who compiled these ahadith, they had access to. Right? So maybe the ulama, they were looking at books. Maybe they were hearing it from the teachers themselves. Maybe they saw the teachers and they authenticated those people themselves on their own. But because I can't authenticate that person, I have to rely on what information I have. The second reason is because we are now unfamiliar with the methods of the previous scholars. Okay? And other reasons why people would rely on just the chain of narrators to look at the hadith. There's another method that some of our prominent scholars of the contemporary scholars have pointed to not just as a method that they are coming up on their own, but as a method of the scholars who were compiling these books. So for example, when Shaykh Atusi, when Shaykh As-Saduq, when Shaykh Al-Kulaini, when they were authenticating their hadith, were they doing it? Were they just looking at the chain of narrators? Because if you were just looking at the chain of narrators, then you'll have a very serious problem, because many of these individuals in this chain, we don't actually know whether they are authentic or not, whether they are authoritative or not. So Ali ibn Ibrahim, we are not sure whether someone has said that that person is authentic or not, and so on and so forth. So there are gaps sometimes that we have, and people point to those gaps and say that, for example, this person, it's not quite clear whether he was a liar, whether he made up a hadith, or whether he didn't, and whether he was truthful. This method, it basically says that, first of all, books played a very prominent role even during the time of Imam Muhammad al-Baqir and Imam Jaffar al-Sadiq. And when you have books being the central way that your ahadith are being transmitted, then you don't have to rely on word of mouth. You can just look back at the book itself. Now, we might not have the books themselves present, but through sort of very critical analysis of the chain of narrators and of the texts themselves, we can compare those books and those ahadith with other ahadith that we have from other sources and other narrators. All right? And there are other issues that are involved in this method, which, again, we can discuss more. But the primary focus here is the role of books, and in particular, the role of books within the Shi'i, the Imami, the Imami tradition, which didn't have a ban on books and which used books to authenticate hadith and to spread those ahadith to other people and to other generations. And one of the reasons why this is so important is because, particularly among the Imami tradition, where you have sort of this question of security. You can't go out into the masjid like the majority schools can and have 100 or 200 different students who are all sitting there listening to the sheikh recite his ahadith. So you maybe have a couple students who gather around, and they have to take these same ahadith and spread it to someone maybe very far away. And so books become a very important and very crucial way of spreading hadith, particularly for the Imami community that has its own very special and very distinct internal dynamics that it has to deal with. And then the final, and there are of course ahadith that in which the Imams, they encourage their companions to write down their hadith and to pass those books on to next generations, right? Again, not just as sort of a family legacy, but as a legacy of the community at large, and to take care of that tradition of writing within the community. This is one hadith of the 6th Imam that I will just pass over, in which the Imam basically says, pass on your books to your children, because there's going to be a time in which you're not going to have access to the Imam, and these are going to be your main way that you are going to have a connection to the Imam and to the teachings of the Imam. The third solution, well, which isn't as commonly known, is a solution that relies not just on data points. And this is an important way of looking at history, not just as individual ahadith, but as a larger sort of a development of hadith and of the history of hadith at large. In other words, instead of looking at either the sanad of the hadith and checking off individuals within that sanad, or looking at the books that each individual took their hadith from, or rather the compilers took their hadith from, and trying to authenticate, well, whether that book or that particular hadith that is found in that book, whether that chain kind of goes back to the Imams. It looks at what was the conclusion of the scholarly community at the time of, for example, Shaykh al-Kulaini, or Shaykh al-Saduq, or, for example, Shaykh al-Tusi. In other words, it's trusting in a process that looks at the larger conclusion of the scholarly community and what is the highest grade of hadith that the community could agree on. Because I could have an individual standard and you could have an individual standard, and our standards could conflict. But when we come together as a community and we agree on the best, on individual ahadith, that gives us the highest assurance that these are hadith that pass the test for all of the different tests that each individual scholar could give. So in other words, it looks at the holistic process as opposed to individual data points. It looks at the collective conclusions of the ulama of the time who had access to all of the resources and were able to, for example, see the books themselves. And finally, it doesn't just look at authenticity. If you remember in one of the first slides that I had, we were saying that it's not just authenticity of the hadith, but it's also talking about, well, what did the Imam mean? Maybe the Imam was saying this hadith in terms of taqiyya. Maybe he was saying it and he was, for example, said something in addition or had physical gestures, like the gesture that your time is up. Physical gestures that, you should end here, right? But other people don't mention that in their books, right? You all might not have seen that physical gesture, and you don't actually know that part of the hadith of the Imam. But because the community of the time of, for example, Shaykh Kulaini, they saw it, and if everybody agrees in that, then because they had more data and they had more access, then looking at what they all agreed on can give us better insight into which ahadith are more authentic and what the conclusions we can draw from those hadith could possibly be. I'll just end there. There is actually a dispute between Sharif al-Murtada and Shaykh al-Tusi, which kind of really expresses this very well. That these two very prominent scholars, they had very conflicting ways of looking at hadith and hadith authenticity. One of them says that we don't just look at the hadith in terms of whether the Imam said it or not, but we have to look at the larger scope. And then the other one says that if we don't have any other information, then that's all that we can rely upon. All right, I will just end there. And inshallah, this was a useful way of looking at not just, again, the common processes that we have heard about in terms of how to authenticate hadith, but see how robust the hadith scholarship is within our scholarly tradition, and that these scholars and these traditions, these methods for authenticating hadith actually go very far back, even during the time of the compilers of those books. And through those methods, we can get a little bit more certainty, a little bit more confidence, itmi'nan, that these are not just people who are coming up with a hadith, fabricating hadith themselves, or even doing their work sloppily and without any mechanism for authenticating, but rather these mechanisms are very proven with the test of time. But also, we might have sometimes questions about those hadith, and which are fair. But at the same time, it gives us a higher level of confidence in that process that those ahadith went through. Thank you all very much. I apologize for going over my time. Wassalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi.